Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're turning back the clock to examine a conflict of such unprecedented scale and absolute devastation that for a long time, humanity simply called it the Great War. We're going to look closely at the timelines, the battlefields, and the immense human cost of a conflict that literally rewired the globe. 1914, a war began that changed the entire world forever. Millions of people died, powerful empires collapsed, and history took a completely new turn. Just think about the sheer weight of those words for a second. The reality of it was even heavier. Okay, let's dive into this. Part 1. The Spark of Global War. To really grasp this, we first have to understand what the world looked like before the fighting actually began. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly what we're talking about. Before a single shot was fired, Europe was this highly complex, deeply entangled web of alliances. Honestly, it was a powder keg just waiting for a match. The globe was fractured into two massive military blocs. The Allied powers, driven primarily by Britain, France, and Russia, facing off against the opposing Central Powers, anchored by Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. The setup was incredibly precarious. If one nation went to war, they were all going to go to war. And that inevitable trigger? It was pulled on June 28, 1914. Over in Sarajevo, a Serbian nationalist assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. This single, violent event sparked a rapid, totally unstoppable chain reaction. Throughout that summer of 1914, those complex military alliances were activated one by one. In just a matter of weeks, localized tension cascaded across Europe, erupting into a deadly global war that would end up raging all the way until 1918. Part 2. Life in the trenches. Because while the outbreak of the war was incredibly rapid, the actual fighting quickly ground to a grueling halt. This became the horrific human reality. Millions of soldiers fighting, living, and sleeping inside deep, muddy ditches for months on end. Imagine being constantly surrounded by freezing, bone-chilling cold, rampant disease, literal starvation, and the unrelenting, deafening sound of explosions. Millions of young men suffered and died right there in the dirt. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how this unending trauma bridges a grim connection to our modern medical understanding. During the war, soldiers began suffering from a severe, agonizing psychological collapse that they called shell shock, which was a direct result of the relentless artillery barrages. Today, medical science recognizes this exact same condition as post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. Part 3. Deadly innovation and massive battles. You see, the trauma of the trenches was magnified by the rapid industrialization of the era. Humanity was suddenly introduced to incredibly deadly modern weapons. This was literally the first major war to use tanks in combat. We also saw the horrifying introduction of poison gas and the absolute brutal efficiency of machine guns. The battlefield didn't even stay on the ground anymore. It expanded up into the skies with airplanes and deep into the seas with submarines. These tools made the conflict deadlier than anything humanity had ever seen before. The sheer scale of horror produced by these weapons is honestly difficult to process. But two major battles capture the different types of nightmares these soldiers faced. The Battle of the Somme was one of the bloodiest of the entire war, where thousands upon thousands of soldiers were killed on the very first day. Sudden, catastrophic mass death. Contrast that with the Battle of Verdun, a grueling, agonizing battle of attrition that dragged on for around 10 whole months, resulting in massive, devastating losses for both France and Germany. Part 4. America enters the conflict. As the years dragged on, the continent was essentially bleeding out and the stalemate felt endless. But then, in 1917, a massive turning point. The United States, who had previously stayed out of the direct fighting, officially entered on the side of the Allies. Driven largely by aggressive submarine attacks from Germany, this arrival of fresh American troops fundamentally shifted the narrative momentum and completely tipped the balance of power. Part 5. The Treaty and the Aftermath. With the balance of power shifted, this grueling war finally reached its breaking point. By 1918, Germany's army was completely, utterly exhausted. Their critical resources had run dry, and the Central Powers simply could not sustain the fight any longer. So, on November 11, 1918, a historic armistice was reached, and the guns finally fell silent. Let's move to and see how this builds into the peace process that followed, because it would literally shape the next century. In 1919, world leaders signed the Treaty of Versailles, forcing incredibly strict conditions upon Germany. They were mandated to pay massive financial reparations, significantly gut their military, and surrender vast territories. Many historians agree today that these severely punitive measures created deep economic despair and a really dangerous simmering anger within Germany. So the crucial point is over 10 million. That is the number of soldiers who died in this conflict. Over 10 million, and millions more were left permanently injured. Entire cities were reduced to rubble, completely wiped off the map. When you stop and really think about it, the human cost is almost unfathomable. And why does this specific conflict matter so much to our modern world? Because the old world was literally erased from the map. The fallout of this war caused four massive, incredibly powerful empires to completely disappear: the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, and the German Empire. The entire global hierarchy collapsed and had to be completely rebuilt. We're going to leave you with this chilling thought from our sources. World War I was not just a war. It was an event that completely changed the future of humanity, and its consequences would eventually lead to an even bigger conflict, World War II. The very treaty that ended the fighting actually planted the seeds for the next global catastrophe. It forces us to ask a profound question. When a war destroys the world, how do you rebuild it without carrying over all that hatred? Thank you for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the history that shapes our present.